Hi, I'm Maven Phoenix, and I'm a principal engineer on the Waypoint team. We've been doing a lot of great work making Waypoint great this year, and I can't wait to share some of that with you. Today, I'm going to be talking about using Waypoint to deploy an application to production on Kubernetes. We're going to be looking at three specific things here. We're going to be using an existing cluster and server. We're not going to be showing the Waypoint server setup. We want the setup to be true to life, like how you'd likely expect it to go. So you should be able to use these exact steps to deploy the application yourself. And lastly, we want to make sure that it covers real-world scenarios rather than just contrived ones for a demo. All right, let's jump right in. What we're going to be doing is deploying a real simple little Go app. It's got some dependencies just like a real app. Let's go ahead and look at the code. This is a 12-factor app, so it's configured with environment variables. Two of those variables control the application's operational mode and how it connects to the database. This is pretty common amongst web frameworks. These also give us a really easy way to test that the app is being deployed and configured correctly. Later on, we're going to be changing these variables to go between production and staging as well, showing more real-world usage. Now, to get this app into Waypoint, we could tell Waypoint about it on the command line. But instead, we're actually going to use some features that are built into Waypoint for launching projects directly out of Git repos. We're going to deploy this directly out of Git because that's a more common production scenario. You've already got the code there, you're ready to go, you just want to deploy it. So in this particular instance, we're purposely deploying an app that hasn't been pre-configured for Waypoint. Now, you can do this because there's a nice feature where you can upload a Waypoint configuration file directly. This allows the Waypoint HCL file to not have to live in Git alongside your code, which is useful for migrating apps and setting up the same code base for multiple different configurations. You can store the configuration in Git along with your code, which is really common as well. We've already got it written in the HCL, so let's go ahead and open it up and take a look at what we're configuring. It's pretty simple, but let's go through some of the various elements. First, we're using Pack to build an OCI image from the actual source code. This uses cloud-native build packs, which can convert the source directly into an OCI image. Next, we're going to be storing that image on AWS ECR into region US West 2 with the repository as well, a predefined repository. Here we're specifying a tag. Now I'm sort of showing off with this tag. It's a little more complicated than it necessarily needs to be. I'm doing it to show you some sort of the interesting things that you can do with a Waypoint HCL file. Now this particular tag is using some HCL and some functions that compose into a really useful tag. So what we're doing is we're including the first 7 digits of the git commit SHA and then the timestamp on the end. And this tag will basically say what we deployed and when we deployed it. It's really handy for debugging code in production. Next, we're going to deploy to Kubernetes. Now you can see here we haven't specified any Kubernetes configuration. We've given all our plugins sensible defaults, configuration that works in the common case, and that's what we're going to be just using here, just the basic configuration. And then we have the release. Now for this, we have to do a little bit more. The release is going to be set up using a Kubernetes service. Specifically, we're going to be deploying on EKS, and we want the load balancer to be directly available via TLS. So we have to add some annotations so that AWS configures everything how we want. We also have to include port 443 here, which is a little weird, but the reason is that Waypoint doesn't yet understand those annotations to be able to automatically configure to switch the load balancer from its default port 80 to 443. Now, let's go ahead and open up the UI, and we're going to use the CLI command that pops up the UI for ease. Now, we're using self-site insert, so I need to go ahead and just accept that. So now let's go ahead and add a project. We're going to configure all of we're going to call it demo. We're going to connect it to Git. We're going to put in information about where to locate it. It's a public repository, so we don't need any authentication. When we configure it, we're actually going to leave off automatic deploys here. If we did automatic deploy, Waypoint would automatically start polling the Git repository, and whenever there was a new commit, it would automatically deploy it up with the new code. We want to look at the individual operations, so we're going to leave that off. Next, let's go grab our Waypoint HCL file that we created, and let's go ahead and put it in here. So we're just copying and pasting it into there. Great. Now let's go ahead and add it. Super. Now we can see that it's automatically pulled it in, and we have the application already known within our demo project. In the future, there will actually be a little Waypoint up button up in the corner, but for right now, we're going to go ahead and use the CLI to deploy the application. Because everything is on the server, we just have to tell Waypoint to deploy our app. We do that by basically saying that we want to deploy a project and an application. Let's go ahead and do it. We're going to do up because we want to do the whole build, deploy, and release. So first, what's happening is we're actually going off and we're building the image with Cloud Native build packs. Now this build is using a feature of 0.6 that allows builds to run directly within the Kubernetes cluster. This took us a long while to get right, and we're really excited about it. It uses a piece of software called Kaneko, which is a project and a technique for building images within an existing container. And we've also wired it up to be able to run we've wired it up to be able to execute build packs as well. It's working super well, and we're really excited about it. Now we've moved on to the actual deploy part. So we're talking to Kubernetes. We've deployed. We go ahead and deployed things, and now we're all done. You can see the release has happened, and we've got the URL for the load balancer. Now let's see what happened. Let's go ahead and make an HTTP request to the app. We're going to use the URL that is listed right here directly with curl and pass in a couple of options to tell curl to not worry about the SSL cert. The reason is we actually have wired this up to the cert is wired up to actual DNS, but we're going to just query it directly with the AWS URL. So right off the bat, we're seeing DNS issues because the load balancer was just created, it's brand new, and AWS takes a little while for the DNS to propagate around. So let's speed this up a little bit. And let's try it again. Great. Now you can see that this is a cert for our real domain. And as well that the app is responding. Now, we can see that this app actually has output an error, and it's an error that's saying that it can't connect to the database. Now that makes sense. I did that on purpose for the demo. The reason is that we didn't configure any database credentials for what it should actually connect to. But more importantly, why did it successfully deploy in the first place? Not being able to access the database seems like a pretty serious problem that you'd hit in production. And you wouldn't really want a deployment at all in that case. Well, the reason is that we didn't tell Kubernetes to do any extra checking by default. The health check it uses by default is just that the application is listening and could respond at all. And it did that. It just couldn't serve any real traffic. So let's go ahead and let's fix it so that we can so the Kubernetes does the right thing. Let's change it so the app has more robust health checking through checking the actual HTTP error code. And that's what we've got here. So you can see what we've done is we added the probe path. And what that will do is that will allow Kubernetes to make an HTTP request to the app, that path on the app, and make sure that it's a 200, that this path returns a 200 to indicate that the deployment is ready to go. So let's go ahead and let's do a deployment now that we've made that change. First, we need to update the HCL on the server though. Now that it's updated, we can do a deploy. Now I've done a Waypoint deploy here instead of an up because we've already built the code. We already know that the previous build is fine. We don't need to rebuild the actual image anymore. Now we start running the deploy, and unlike last time, we can see that it's actually taking a little bit longer. I've sped it up so that we don't have to wait as long. Now you can see that Waypoint is actually giving us a lot more information about what went on and saying that the deployment failed. That's exactly what we wanted. So what you can see is Waypoint is outputting some information from the Kubernetes event system. Specifically here, it's telling us that the probe failed in the allowed amount of time. That's exactly what we expected. This app couldn't start up and it's going to fail those probes. So let's go ahead and go back and add the database credentials. Now there's a couple of ways we could do this. We could do this on the UI and in the CLI. We're right here on the CLI. So let's go ahead and just do it right here. So we configured our database URL. Now one of the really cool features of Waypoint is that even though we didn't just perform a new deploy, that updated configuration information is actually fed to the existing deployments. And it will actually live reload the application when the configuration changes without you having to do a new deployment. So remember that deployment that we did before, the one that came up but had an error? And but the one that came up said it was good, but it was actually hitting an error. Now let's go ahead and curl the endpoint again and see what that application, that deployment is doing now. Hey, look at that. Suddenly it's working. The reason is that Waypoint automatically restarted the process when it saw the new configuration information and now can connect to the database just fine. So I guess we could sort of just go on, but we're actually trying to see that that probe path works correctly. So let's go ahead and do a deployment with the probe path just to show that everything is working as we expect it. So now we're doing the deployment. Kubernetes is doing all of the normal checks. Great. The Waypoint worked, or the deployment worked. Now we can see that we've deployed successfully and everything got released. You can see that it's using the same load balancer as before. You can also see that this second one, that we're actually on v3 in the deployment URL. That lets us access this deployment directly if we need to, which is great for when you're just trying to make sure that everything is still working okay. But if we look back, we can see that the app environment isn't correct. It says development, but we're actually in production. Let's go ahead and set that to production. And just like before, the configuration will be picked up automatically. So all we have to do is wait a second for the process to restart, and then we can curl it again. Great. Now it says production. We didn't have to do another deployment for that to be picked up. It just did it automatically. One other great thing that's coming out in 0.6 is Waypoint will perform resource tracking to give you more information about what it actually does. Now this is just the status of the project. We can see some basic information about when the last deployment was done. We want to get a little more specific information, so let's do the status for the application itself. So here we've got a whole bunch more information. Not only do we have the top level information about the deployment, but we've also got information about the specific Kubernetes resources that we deployed. We see that they're healthy, when they were created, and all kinds of really interesting things. This will help people look at and use Waypoint to understand what exactly Waypoint's doing and debug it if there is an issue. Now, we're not really ready for production because we've only got one replica of our application. So let's go ahead and adjust that now. Now we could go in and change our Waypoint HCL file to configure a fixed number of replicas, but that would just be a guess. Instead, let's show off the 0.6 feature, the ability to configure auto-scaling. We've got the config open here, and it's just like from before, but now we're adding these few lines. First, before we didn't have any resource limitations or requests, so we need to add some so that the autoscaler knows what to monitor. Here, we're configuring how much CPU each replica needs. Now, this is the kind of the strange Kubernetes syntax for specifying CPU and cores. This particular syntax means 10% of a CPU core. Then we've got this nice little simple autoscale block. Here, we're specifying the minimum and maximum number of replicas, and as well the target CPU percentage of each replica. Now, 40% is pretty low. You could crank that up as high as you wanted. This will configure a Kubernetes autoscaler pod autoscaler in the cluster associated with the Kubernetes deployment. And Kubernetes will sample the CPU usage of the individual pods and automatically adjust the total replicas. Let's go ahead and deploy that now. First, we need to update it on the server, the configuration on the server, and now we can go ahead and do a deploy. Great, our deployment worked out, and now we're releasing it. Super. We've got the status, everything looks good. We can see now that we've also got a horizontal pod autoscaler that's been created under the deploy resources. Also, let's use kubectl to get a more in-depth view of what Waypoint configured. You can see the pods here that were created. And also, we've now got this pod autoscaler. So now we actually have a pretty good production configuration. This will automatically go and contract based on the number of replicas. But we're not really done yet, because you can't really call it staging a production until you have a staging environment. So let's go ahead and use some new features to configure the staging environment. We're going to be using Workspace variables, a new feature in 0.6. This lets us use the exact same configuration for both production and staging. Workspace variables allow different configuration variables to be sent to deployments based on the workspace that the deployment's in. In our case, we want to change that database URL. Now, briefly, workspaces are just little containers that separate resources. So if you had a build in one workspace, it'd only be able to be viewable for that deployment. If you don't specify a workspace, you're using the workspace called default. So let's go ahead and create a new workspace. All you need to do to create a workspace is to use it. Let's go ahead and do Waypoint up against our new workspace. First, let's set some configuration variables that are specific to our new staging workspace. So we're going to set a database URL as well as the application environment that this is going to be for. Next, let's go ahead and bring up the staging environment. All we had to do is specify workspace equals staging there, and it'll automatically deploy this brand new application into that staging workspace. So because we are separated, we have to build a new image just like before. We can go ahead and speed that up a little bit. Great. Everything came up. This URL is different than the one before, and the different from the production one as before, so that we know that it's actually a different environment. And let's go ahead and curl it to make sure that everything came up correctly. Super. Everything looks good. One really great feature about using workspace variables is that it lets us use the same configuration between staging and production, which is huge. That lets us avoid lots of different configuration drift, which is a huge problem when you're trying to set up staging and production. As those things drift out of date, you have less and less confidence in your staging environment. So being able to use the same configuration and just configure it separately is really huge. So what did we see today? Well, we saw the ability for Waypoint to do some validation on deployments. It uses probes to be able to safely do new deployments, knowing that the configuration is working and that when your deployment actually gets released, your application is not going to go down. We saw the new 0.6 feature for autoscaling, showing off how easy it is to manage deployments and autoscale and scale out your application based off of CPU usage. And lastly, we saw multi-environment. the ability to configure both a staging and a production setup with the same configuration, just using Waypoint workspaces to deploy directly to two separate applications. That's it. It was great showing you this demo today. Have a great day.